Hello, this is Julian with Coffee Reviews, and today we'll be reviewing the Christmas coffee, wash processed Panama from Leuchtfeuer Coffee. And there's the bag right there. And Leuchtfeuer, based out of Wedel, Germany. And this coffee is the second of our December 2024 coffees of the month, as is voted on by you guys as one of the coffees you'd most like to see us review. Once again, for context, this coffee won our Instagram poll, while the Tim Wendelbo Caragoda won our YouTube poll, so we decided to review both coffees. That being said, going into that poll, this is the coffee that I initially wanted to win that poll, largely due to the fact that it is a non-geisha washed Panamanian coffee, and I very much enjoy reviewing those sorts of coffees. However, when I found out that this coffee was listed on the medium side of their spectrum, I was a little hesitant. Even then, it did win that poll, so it'll definitely be interesting to review something on the more developed side of their spectrum, as this right here is day 38. And recipe we went with for this coffee was our standard recipe, at a 16:1 water to coffee ratio, brewed at 96 degrees Celsius, about 205 degrees Fahrenheit. And I like this one best through the V60, which indicates a more medium fine grind. Roast profile for this coffee. So for context, Leuchtfeuer isn't necessarily the lightest roasting European coffee roaster out there to begin with, and they did identify this one as being on the medium side of their spectrum. That being said, this one's definitely still turned out a fair bit more developed than I was expecting, even with that profile going into it, as I feel like a lot of people could either say that this is on the true side of that medium spectrum, which is to say that it's notably more developed than the vast majority of coffees that we do review from European coffee roasters, and I feel like some people might even say that it's on the medium plus side of that spectrum, as this one had so much development to it in terms of the overall roasting qualities that a lot of people would say it's even further along that spectrum. I will say it's still, for the most part, probably a true medium by most standards and metrics. With all that out of the way, let's go and start discussing this coffee. Day 14, first impression through the V60, and the coffee was coming out as expected, as it's very honey-like with a honey-forward aspect to it, and definitely plenty of the developed qualities, but it is presented in a balanced sense, as it wasn't too overbearing right from the start. Listed apple compote felt apt, as there's a nice level of that apple-like brightness and sweetness, so it was off to a decent start, and I said, okay, I shouldn't be too concerned about that medium profile. This was just fine. It wasn't necessarily what I was looking for, but even then, maybe some tinkering and adjustments can really help this coffee. Day 17 through the Chemex, and it was immediately roastier and smokier this time around, as it felt like there was a lot more of those qualities reminiscent of a true medium coffee, especially in terms of the strong traditionality and intensity, as it did have a very lingering smokiness to it in that sense. Little in ways of specific descriptions, as the profile just did seem to hinder a majority of the experiences. I do have a little bit more difficulty kind of discerning a lot of flavor notes when it comes to profiles of coffees that are a little bit more on the developed side of things, and that was certainly the case here on day 17. Day 20 through the April brewer, and there's a little better result, as a lower extraction adjustments might help the overall development of this one, as there's a slight bit more definition to it, a little bit more of that prominent honey and candied attribute, while the cup does still remain on the more robust side of things. So still pretty mixed results, as it's still kind of skewing a lot more in the direction that I didn't necessarily want this coffee to go, but I kind of knew it would be extremely difficult to mitigate the circumstances of this one. Day 23 through the V60 with some lower extraction adjustments, so lower temperatures, higher concentration. And the struggles with this coffee do continue, as it does continue to remain very smoky and robust overall, with the best of it coming right off brew before it does cool down into a pretty roasty experience in a very lingering sense. Honey does feel the most apt of the listed notes, as it's presented in a darker honey sense, so that was kind of my issue with this coffee, even with the adjustments. Right off brew, I said, okay, it's fine, but you let the coffee cool down even just a little bit, and at that moment, it does seem to just skew heavily in the overall smoky and roasty qualities of it. Day 26 through the Chemex with the same adjustments, and it's possibly the best the coffee had been to this point, as it's offering a little bit more of the sweetness to it. It's presented in a little bit more defined of a sense, as I could see a little bit more of a chocolate-like sweetness this time around, and a little bit more of that candied component with some honey buried underneath that very strong roastiness. But that was, once again, a lot of the hindering qualities of this one, was that it was just so heavy in that sense. A lot more of that robust, smoky, just heavier quality to this one. Day 29 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and the coffee continues to struggle as its best off brew before settling into a lot more of those smoky qualities. And that's been very consistent with this coffee. Is right off brew I say, okay, I can take a couple of sips before it really just seems to lose a lot of its structure and head heavily in that more developed tone. Traditional chocolate feel with a lingering honeyed aspect to it, and a slight bit more of that palm fruit brightness before it settles into that just very strong, robust smokiness. Day 32 through the Chemex with our standard recipe, and there's still more issues and struggles with this coffee as it is just very developed, making it difficult to gather too much outside of the just strong coffee-like feel of it. And oftentimes I don't necessarily enjoy describing coffee like that, but it just reminds, I would say, me of what a lot of people associate the flavor of coffee to taste like, with a little bit more of that just heaviness to it. Day 35 through the V60 with our standard recipe, and this was one of the best days of this one as it was best right off brew. So I tried to jot down as many of the notes in that tasting wheel as I could right after we had brewed it. It does have a little bit of that robust chocolate as fully expected, a slight caramelized sweetness, some honey qualities, and a bit of the listed apple-like brightness before the finish leans heavily into that roasty, heavier, and just long-lasting quality on this one. All right, let's go ahead and put up the tasting wheel so you can see what we're getting. And we have one level 5, so let's go through that one real quick. And that is the finish level 5. And it won't come as a surprise to too many people that the finish skews pretty heavily in the more roasty qualities of this one, as it does have a lot of that in a very lingering sense. And every single time I took a sip of this coffee, especially when we were reviewing it, I said, it's just so long lasting and I'm getting so much of this that it does have to score that level 5. And obviously it's not necessarily overly ideal for me, given that the finish is something that I'm not necessarily enjoying with this coffee to begin with. So level 5, and in a very lingering sense, obviously not ideal for me. A couple of level 4s. Let's start with the chocolate level 4. So they do have a chocolate note list on here, and they do list it as being a white chocolate, but for me it's definitely a little bit more of that darker chocolate quality, given that it's got so much more of that traditional heavier coffee-like feel to it in that sense. So it definitely scores higher on that level 4 mark. I couldn't necessarily see white chocolate, but for me, it still had so many of those more smoky chocolate qualities to it. And that takes us into our next one, smokiness level 4. I honestly cannot remember the last time that we did score any coffee that high in terms of the smoky quality, as that's what I was alluding to when describing the profile of this coffee. There are certainly darker, more developed coffees out there than this one, but as far as it goes for coffees that we review on this channel, this one might be the most developed coffee that we've reviewed in several years or so, which is to say that it just had so much smokiness to it and that roastier quality, and it scored extremely high, as that level 4 is just extremely high for what we review. It's very rare we have coffees even score a level 3, let alone a level 4 in that manner. Couple of level 3s. We will start with the sweetness level 3. It did have some sweetness. It's presented right off brew, and it can be very nice. You get it in a couple of different ways. So that chocolate can have a little bit of sweetness, the honey can have a little bit of sweetness, but most notably for me, there's a little bit of a caramelized sweetness, which is the best part of this coffee for me when you are able to experience it. So there's something with that. Brightness level 3. And it's so interesting for a coffee that just has this much heaviness and robustness to it, that there's a little bit of that apple-like aspect poking through that does score this one at that level 3 mark. So that's kind of counter to what you might expect for this coffee, given the profile of it. Florality, level 3, don't necessarily have a good descriptor on the floral components to it. I would say maybe a little bit more along the lines of a floral honey aspect, as that was definitely one of the more pronounced qualities to it, and it wasn't necessarily presented in a sweeter sense, but it was presented in a sense that you were just feeling a little bit more of that honey-like tone to it. Citrus fruit, level 3, that's going to be that apple once again, as that's always the best place to put it in terms of the fruit profiles. And then the caramel at that level 3, I mentioned that that's the most enjoyable part of this coffee for me, is that slight caramelized sweetness that is pretty fleeting. I do have to say that given that this coffee is just a little bit more traditional, it was, I would say, probably one of the more pronounced components to it on certain moments. So level 3 is where we opted to put that. Bitterness level 3, and it pains me to say this, but the bitterness is that coffee-like bitterness that a lot of people do associate coffee with being bitter. So that's where that comes from, as it certainly had a lot of those qualities. Final thing, well, 2 more things worth discussing actually. Body, level 2. Interestingly enough, not a lot of body, given that this coffee is along the profile that it is, and I was really surprised by that, but it definitely does still score on the lower side of that. And then the final thing worth discussing, and this probably pains me the most out of everything we've discussed, cleanliness level 2. And I will say this. I've said in the past that my setup isn't really made for more developed coffees. So I feel like maybe if I had some harder water, maybe if I was better at brewing more developed coffees, and maybe we could get a little bit more cleanliness and clarity to this coffee. But given that it was just so heavily hindered by the smokiness, the development, the roastiness of this quality, then it shouldn't come as too much of a surprise that it scored that level 2. At least with a level 3, when it comes to wash processed coffees, you're able to pull out a lot of the characteristics. But I said the majority of the time, I had a very difficult time discerning a lot of the flavor notes in this coffee, largely due to the fact that what I continuously tasted was roast and just smokiness. So for that reason, it would have been very hard for me to justify it scoring any higher than that level 2 mark. So that's where I had to put it, which is once again an anomaly for a wash processed coffee. Outside of that though, as I am looking at this tasting wheel, I do think it is a pretty good representation of what I was getting from this coffee. All right, so my overall thoughts and impressions of this coffee. Let me start with this. I think it is beneficial for me to actually have a review like this on this channel, largely due to the fact that we don't review a lot of more developed coffees in general. So it's nice to maybe feature at least one of those every so often. So here's one of those. But that being said, going into it, I would have had a lot higher expectations for this coffee given what it is. I always say that when it comes to non-Gesha washed Panamanian coffees, the potential is immensely high. I've had so many of them in the past that I very much enjoy. Ironically, from the same coffee roaster, the SL34 that we had reviewed from them in the past was one of my favorite coffees that we had ever reviewed, at least as far as Panamanian non-Gesha coffees go. So that's a testament to how good I know they're capable of doing with these coffees. That being said, I'm not entirely sure why they went in the direction of this coffee that they did, and maybe it's appealing to a much more broad audience with what this coffee is supposed to be. But it does remind me of a conversation that I had with them in the past, in the very distant past, as I actually was very interested in this coffee when they were first bringing it on, but I found out that they were going to use it as an espresso roast. So I don't think that this coffee was ever intended to be roasted in a lighter profile. I don't think it was ever intended to be along the lines of what my own preferences are, and I will still chalk this one up to myself as I wasn't able to get the best out of this coffee. But I continuously say I'm not really set up to brew a coffee like this to begin with, so it's obviously going to be a coffee that I didn't necessarily enjoy given the way that it turned out. That's just kind of the best way I can summarize this one. Type of person I would suggest this coffee to, if you do like your more medium, more developed coffees, then this one can be a pretty good fit for you, as it does offer some additional characteristics to it. So it does have a little bit of sweetness, it does have a very robust, heavier chocolate aspect to it, it does have a little bit of brightness, so it does give you a little bit more depth than just being a one-dimensional, we'll say, overly old school coffee. So there's a little bit more to it than just that. Kind of the best direction I can point somebody towards on this one, and also the best way I can leave this review. If you by chance had an opportunity to try this coffee, I'd love to know your thoughts and impressions of it as well. If you're enjoying the content, give this video a like, subscribe if you're not already subscribed. This right here has been a review of the Christmas coffee, wash processed Panama from Leuchtfeuer Coffee. Thank you for watching.